Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Sat Bir Khalsa, and I'm thrilled to be offering this webinar entitled Yoga in Prisons, the Scientific Rationale and Research Evidence. This is through the Give Back Yoga University, which is a virtual campus for yoga professionals, healthcare workers, and academic researchers in order to share knowledge and exchange ideas. So a little bit more about myself. I am an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a full-time yoga researcher. I also spend a good deal of time promoting research on yoga through the International Association of Yoga Therapists annual symposium on yoga research, and as chief editor of the medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. So this presentation is going to be an entirely PowerPoint presentation, and as you have questions going through the talk, you are welcome to post them to the Q&A box, and I will hopefully have some time at the end to address some of those questions. So please enter those questions into the Q&A box as the talk proceeds. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Before we really address, I want to do some introductory comments with respect to prisons themselves, and then of course the rationale for yoga in prisons, and then we'll delve into the science and the research that's been done on yoga in prison populations. So this is a website from the federal government, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I just want to draw your attention to sort of the goals overall of incarceration. The idea that these are controlled environments, and there's a strong impetus for them to be safe, for them to be humane, for them to be cost efficient, and provide work and other self-improvement opportunities to assist offenders in becoming law-abiding citizens. So it's not just about a humane environment, it's also about getting these prisoners in a condition where they won't reoffend and be reincarcerated. So along with that, there are a lot of problems still in trying to achieve those goals. And there are a number of prison challenges, of course, for all prisoners. Obviously, they lack freedom. And whenever you are in a situation where you lose control, that's a situation that generates a lot of stress and other issues. Of course, there's a lot of privacy issues. There's lack of family contact. Prisons are known for having a good deal of abuse, including substance abuse, violence. And then, of course, it's a community environment, so you're much more prone to infectious disease. And then your physical activity may well be restricted as well. As I mentioned, chronic stress is probably one of the biggest things. All of these characteristics will enhance this experience of chronic stress. And chronic stress itself is a major player in the development of all kinds of problems, particularly things like mental health, that's mood disturbance, things like anxiety, depression. And then, of course, prison populations often have a good deal of other emotive problems, including things like anger management, impulsivity. And then, of course, chronic stress also generates insomnia, and insomnia itself will then exacerbate some of these other problems, including chronic stress itself. A lot of prisoners also have experienced trauma, and so there's other symptoms that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, including mental health symptoms and behavioral disturbances. There's a good deal of aggression, violence, and antisocial and criminal behavior that has to be addressed in this population if these people are really to be rehabilitated. Another issue is really chronic disease. There is an epidemic in the general population of so-called non-communicable diseases. The risk factors for these are sedentary behavior, poor dietary choices, chronic stress, and of course, these are the same risk factors, if not worse, in prison settings. So things like hypertension, obesity, and other chronic diseases are also going to be at issue in the prison population, if not even worse than in the general population. Then, of course, there's this idea of recidivism or reoffending. In fact, the United States itself has the highest rate of reoffending. That's 70% of prisoners will end up back in prison within 3 years, and 83% will end up back in prison in 9 years. So this is a major issue. And whatever we can do, obviously, to reduce recidivism, that would be gold in terms of the prison system. Substance abuse is a major issue. Half of inmates have substance abuse disorder. So this is a major, major problem. Finally, there's, in terms of, the problems, there's mental health problems, but also, of course, these prisoners are lacking in positive psychological states. They have poor self-esteem, they lack self-compassion, and then higher issues like life purpose and meaning, life goals, and spirituality are also severely compromised. So there's a good deal of issues that prisoners face. So now we raise the issue of how can yoga potentially ameliorate some of these issues and perhaps even generate some positive psychological states. And let's talk about yoga itself and what it consists of, and then what we know about its benefits and how it works. When I'm talking about yoga, I'm not just talking about the postures and exercises. I'm talking about sort of the traditional practice of yoga, which incorporates also the breathing techniques, or the pranayama, the deep relaxation practices, and meditation component. And many of us who are scholars and academics would actually argue that the meditative component is the most important component, and that the physical components are really there to support that contemplative cognitive component. And so this is our definition, that's our working definition of what we're calling yoga. And I would say most yoga prison programs are really incorporating multiple components. Now, when we break this down and look at the effects of these practices, we can see that all 4 of these components, either together as a full yoga practice or even independently, all work on the physical body in this box, which I'm calling fitness. As we know, yoga exercises are very unique and different from Western aerobic type exercises. They're more focused on flexibility, isometric exercises. But they do lead to changes in strength, coordination, and balance, and even the respiratory function, both through the asanas as well as through the pranayama practice. And overall, that leads to a self-efficacy in the physical body, which translates through the mind-body connection into psychological self-efficacy. And the research in this area is very strong. We know from many studies now that we can take naive people, give them a yoga intervention for a couple of months, and indeed we see these changes. Furthermore, these changes are very different on the body than Western type aerobic exercises. In fact, we believe that these types of physical exercises generate more of a psychological sort of relaxation response effect than you can get with aerobic type exercises. Now, it's also through all 4 of these practices that we improve what I'm calling self-regulation of internal state. And by internal state, I'm referring both to physical state as well as psychological state. And perhaps the most important manifestation of this is in the management of stress regulation, and the management of emotions, emotion regulation. And over time with practice, these lead to the skills and characteristics of resilience to stress and equanimity in the face of the ups and downs of the challenges with emotions. And as we achieve this, we reach a self-efficacy in terms of self-regulation of this internal state. Now, this is significant because in modern society and modern medicine, for that matter, self-regulation is not really part of the package. In modern medicine, for example, the doctor treats the public or the patients. And there's not the sense or the idea that patients can generate much in terms of changes internally. But this is something that yoga can really provide. Now, it's largely through the meditative component, through the focus of attention in the act of meditation, that we end up increasing mind-body awareness, which is also known as mindfulness, which has become a very popular term in modern psychology as well as society as a whole. Through this act of meditation, we learn to engage the attention networks of the brain, become better and better at that. And that leads to improvements in cognition and concentration. And over time, that leads to an increased ability to self-regulate our own thought processes. And we achieve a state that's called metacognition, the realization and understanding that although we have thoughts, that's not who we are. We know that because we can change our reactivity and our relationship to our thought processes. And in fact, we can even end up generating control over those thought processes. We can change what we're thinking and how we're thinking. And metacognition is very powerful. It in fact underlies the most powerful and universal form of psychotherapy that's used today, which is called cognitive behavioral therapy, which emphasizes this whole idea of self-regulation of thought processes. And that has enormous impact for mental health characteristics and disorders such as anxiety and depression. Now, it's also largely through the meditation component, the contemplative component of yoga, that we start to achieve these deeper experiences during our yoga practice, this induction of the unitive state, experiences of transcendence, what's called the flow state, the sense of immersion. And that ultimately leads many practitioners to this deeper transformation, a change and a positive improvement in what we call life meaning and purpose. People will say things like, yoga changed my life. It leads to this deeper, more profound change in life perspective and relationship to oneself and to one's goals and to the rest of society as a whole. And I've called this box pure spirituality. Now, in terms of research, the self-regulation and awareness boxes actually have a good deal of research done on them. And that's through a lot of the research that's been done with these brain scanners, with neuroimaging, biochemical measures, questionnaire self-report measures, and even now molecular biological techniques. And we're really starting to come to an understanding of how the central nervous system, how the brain works with respect to the increase in mind-body awareness and this ability to self-regulate internal state, particularly the autonomic nervous system as well as the central nervous system. And the weak sister here in terms of research is really spirituality, but there is some compelling research that does give us confidence that over time, these kinds of practices can lead to these contemplative states. Now, one thing you can see from this model is we're making changes across a broad spectrum of human functioning, from the gross level of muscles and connective tissue to the deepest experiences that humans can have, and everything in between. And so as a consequence, we're achieving sort of changes in what I'm calling global human functionality, from the gross level of the physical and mental health and performance to these deeper skills and characteristics of stress and emotion regulation, awareness and mindfulness, and ultimately metacognition. And over time, and typically with longer practice and longer regular practice, positive psychological states, behaviors, improvements in well-being, values, life purpose and meaning, and spirituality. So immediately you can see from this logic model all of the benefits that come and accrue from yoga practice, that there's a lot of relevance to the problems that we showed with respect to the prison population. And so this allows us to really sort of construct a rationale of how and why yoga should be something that would be very beneficial for prison populations. So let's talk about exactly the rationale for bringing yoga into the prison population. And first of all and foremost, there's this idea of stress and arousal reduction. And this happens both on the physical and the psychological level. There's two branches of the stress system, the autonomic nervous system with sympathetic drive, sympathetic nerves, adrenaline, and then the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, whose stress output is the stress hormone cortisol. And stress, as I mentioned, is a major player, not only in mental health characteristics, but also as a driver for many diseases. So this is a really primary effect of and benefit of yoga practice that immediately affects prison populations. The increase in mind-body awareness and mindfulness is something that allows individuals to become aware of their current state, both psychological and physiological. And awareness and mindfulness of your internal state is really essential if you're going to be able to take the next step. So one of the prime examples is addictive behavior. one needs to acknowledge and experience the fact that one is addicted to a substance before one can really successfully hope to engage in any kind of behavior that can get one away from that kind of behavior. So the increase in mind-body awareness and mindfulness is a critical factor in behavior change. So overall, we're talking about this increase in self-regulation, which gives individuals a sense of self-efficacy and a sense of empowerment. And that, of course, goes together with improvements in mood and psychological well-being. We're also then talking about improvements in dysfunctional behaviors, and then also sleep quality. Sleep is a major player, both in physical health as well as in mental health. And then finally, as we talked about, this idea of induction of contemplative states and transcendence. I mean, I think that the worldview of many offenders is really fairly limited. As a society, in society as a whole, we are actually fairly materialistically oriented in terms of our life goals. And certainly that plays a role in prison populations and in prisoners and in reoffenders and in the criminal mind state. So this whole idea of induction of contemplative states and transcendence can get one deeply out of that. And there's some literature as well out there in terms of the research that's being done showing that spirituality can make a difference in prison populations. And that ultimately will lead to a philosophical and a psychological transformation in one's worldview. This change in goals and life meaning and purpose can be really substantial in terms of underlying total success in terms of avoiding reincarceration. So as you can see, there's a good rationale for this in the prison population. Now, yoga is being applied in prison populations, and if you go onto Amazon and just take a quick look, you'll see there's quite a few books already. This is the Prison Yoga Project by James Fox. This book, Bound to Be Free, The Liberating Power of Prison Yoga, Yoga in Prisons, Yoga for Inmates, Prison Yoga, A Soul Call from Prison, and even some personal anecdotes from individuals who have practiced yoga and that helped them get out. So this one here, Going Om, and then Hey Yoga Man, yoga practices for everyday life from a prison yoga practice. And then, of course, there is actually a book that was produced by the Yoga Service Council. So anyone that's interested in this area, this is a must-read book. This is available on Amazon. It's called The Best Practices for Yoga in the Criminal Justice System. It was put together by a number of yoga instructors who are deeply involved in populations who face incarceration. And it's got a lot of very valuable information as to how to get involved in a yoga practice, how to bring yoga into prisons, and all of the pitfalls and the experience of these yoga instructors in their success with their programs. So these are some of the existing programs that are out there. These are well-established programs. In fact, many of them have training programs for yoga instructors to train yoga instructors how to bring yoga into prisons, how to teach in the prison population, because you can't just walk in and teach everyday yoga as you're doing in a studio. This is a specific population, and they have specific characteristics and behaviors. And so these programs will really serve as a foundation for instructing yoga instructors how to teach in prison populations. So this is the Prison Yoga Project. This is Conviction Yoga, and you can go to these websites and see all of the programs that they have, and all the training programs as well. This is Yoga Behind Bars. Peace is an inside job. This is prison yoga and meditation, and reinforcing the idea that prisons are places of great human suffering, and yoga is very good at dealing with this whole idea of suffering. So this cartoon reads, "Court is in session, the jury is seated, and when the counselors have stretched out properly, we will proceed with opening statements." And I truly see that over time, yoga will be incorporated into the justice system. In fact, judges and lawyers are under chronic stress, and this pervades the whole system. And in fact, prison guards themselves and prison administrators are also under chronic stress. This is a stressful field of the criminal justice system. So now let's turn our attention to the research evidence that we have for yoga in prison populations. And there are a few review papers that have summarized some of the research that's been done. This is a growing field with a number of studies that have been published, and it's a growing body of literature, which allows scientists to start summarizing the breadth and depth of this literature. This is a paper published in 2016, and they concluded in this review paper that yoga may be able to help with the rehabilitation of offenders. Yoga has been shown to improve some key variables related to offending, for example, impulsivity and aggression, as well as showing improvements on variables that could increase offenders' abilities to participate in treatments that are specifically aimed at reducing their risk of criminal behavior, for example, depression, attention, and emotion regulation. So this fits exactly with the rationale that we've just presented. This is a meta-analysis, which is really a statistical analysis of a number of papers that have been published on yoga in the prison population. This was published in 2016. And this is a summary plot here that looks at characteristics. This top graph is looking at psychological well-being, whereas the bottom chart is looking at behavioral functioning. And listed here are a list of studies that have been conducted and all the statistics that go along with them. But really the summary, the bottom take-home message is here. This vertical line of 0 means that there was no change and there was no benefit from the yoga practice. Anything to the right favors the yoga intervention. And so what you can see is all these studies do favor the yoga intervention compared to no treatment for the control condition in that particular study. And the same is true for behavioral functioning. You see that the majority of studies are showing positive benefit. This is another systematic review and meta-analysis. And this was published also a few years ago in 2015. They concluded that yoga has a significant potential and suitability for use in a prison setting. As psychological well-being and behavioral functioning of prisoners are positively affected, yoga and meditation could contribute significantly to improving prisoner quality of life, prison culture, and outcomes. Programs of longer duration having a slightly larger positive effect compared with more intensive programs. The effects of yoga and meditation programs are likely to occur over a longer period rather than a shorter one. There is sufficient evidence to date to suggest that yoga and meditation practices have promising effects on prison populations. So a couple of key findings here as the literature starts to grow. One is this whole idea that programs that spend a longer time over longer months are more beneficial than sort of shorter, more intensive yoga programs. And this makes sense because a lot of these changes take place in the central nervous system and in our behavior, in our psychology. And over months, these changes can be more ensconced when you have more time applied to the intervention. The other thing here I want to point out is this whole idea of prison culture. As you start to get benefit in a small population of prisoners, that starts to have its impact on the rest of the prison population. This is a society. This is an enclosed group of individuals. And so as you start to change some individuals in terms of their behavior, there's going to be a spillover effect. And so this whole idea of changing the entire prison culture is something that is feasible if yoga becomes more applied across all of the prison population. This is another systematic review, and they concluded here that the field of criminology has only recently introduced the study of yoga in jails and prisons. It was the early 2000s that gave light to more spiritual approaches to crime prevention and rehabilitation, leading to more holistic practices inside jails and prisons today. Now, jails and prisons all around the world, including Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, have incorporated some form of yoga, mindfulness meditation, and/or other spiritual practices such as Qigong, breathing practices, and the arts into rehabilitation. Research has demonstrated significant improvements in inmates' behavior across 5 key criminogenic variables: negative effects, substance abuse, anger and hostility, relaxation capacity, and self-esteem, as well as optimism, thanks to yoga, mindfulness, and meditation. Researchers have found prison yoga to be a useful tool for rehabilitation. Yoga, along with its components, mindfulness and meditation, has the potential to transform the lives of inmates inside and possibly outside prison walls. So now let's take a look at some of the individual studies that have been published. This was research that was done in the UK out of Oxford University. And this was a 10-week yoga course, and they showed improvements in behavioral control and decreases in psychological stress. So positive affect here is mood. And the green triangles here represent the yoga intervention before the intervention and after the intervention. You can see the improvement in positive mood state. And if anything, there's a slight decline, but really no change in the control group that did not practice yoga. In terms of perceived stress, you can see a significant drop in perceived stress in those that were practicing yoga, modest change, if any, in the control group. And then finally, psychological distress, again, a nice reduction with the yoga intervention and little change with the control condition. This is a study also from that same group in the UK. And what they're looking at here is the relationship between the number of yoga classes attended and the outcome. So here they're looking at changes in negative mood. And in this graph here, they're looking at perceived stress. And what they're plotting on the horizontal axis is the amount of yoga classes attended. In other words, the dose of the yoga. And what you can see is that both negative mood state and perceived stress decrease with more yoga classes attended. And this is the kind of result that we expect to see, that the more people practice, because it is a behavioral practice, the more people are going to benefit. In fact, it's plotted here in terms of change in perceived stress and change in negative affect. Those who never practiced the yoga intervention had virtually no change in perceived stress. In fact, they even maybe got a little bit worse in perceived negative mood state. And what you can see is that anyone who practiced at least once per week or 5 times per week, you can see significant improvements in both perceived stress, and certainly 5 or more shows improvements in negative mood state. This is a study that was done on female inmates looking at psychological characteristics. Here is the treatment group results in terms of perceived stress. We see a nice drop in the treatment group from a score of 24 to about 20. No change in the control group. In fact, it went from about 26 to 27. In terms of the measures of stress in another measure, the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, you can also see a reduction from about 37 to about 30. And again, very little change in the control group. So it does show impact in terms of improvements. And you can see modest improvements in depression and anxiety as well. And then also some change in rumination. This is a study from published in the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, looking at incarcerated women. And here you can see improvements in self-reported stress. Before, the stress is higher. Afterwards, the stress is lower. They did this in multiple populations in terms of the severity of incarceration. So maximum security, minimum security, and then community incarceration. You can see all 3 show improvements in chronic stress. And in terms of depression, these are scores on the Beck Depression Inventory. You can see reductions in the yoga group and virtually no change in the control group. This is a study that is coming out of Sweden by a group that's published a number of nice papers and looking at a number of particular mental health and behavior factors. This is antisocial behavior self-report instrument that measures that. And what you can see is that the yoga group showed a statistically significant decline, whereas the control condition that did not practice yoga had no change over time. This again is from that same Swedish group. This is a recent publication out of 2018. And what you can see here is a number of improvements that were notable. Obsessive compulsive behavior dropping significantly in the control group. This was statistically significant. Paranoid ideation and somaticization. These are characteristics that are relevant. And then there's a trend for improvement in interpersonal sensitivity. This is male prison inmates, and this was published very recently in 2019. And here they're looking at other mental health characteristics. This is self-directedness. The yoga group here is in the green, and you can see the increase in that metric of self-directedness, little change in the control group. Harm avoidance, another behavior that's associated with prison populations, and then cooperativeness, something that's very important in the prison environment itself. And you can see that the yoga is showing some positive benefit, but perhaps not statistically significant changes, as this research needs more time. We're still in the infancy in this area of showing improvements. This is an early study that actually addressed a very important characteristic, and that is reincarceration rate or recidivism. So in this study, they looked at, this was a 5-year study of 190 inmates, which found that those who were taught a form of yoga called Ananda Marga Yoga, subjects were divided into 2 groups: those who attended at least 1 but less than 4 classes, and those who attended more than 4 classes. So they sort of divided up the groups into those that ended up practicing and those that essentially didn't. During a 2-year post-release period, of those who attended more than 4 classes, 8.5% were reincarcerated, while 25% of those who attended fewer than 4 classes were reincarcerated during this same period. So these results really are supporting this idea that the more an individual practices yoga, the more it's affecting the bottom line, actually, of recidivism. So it's 3 times higher for those that practice very minimally. And this is really critical. This is the kind of evidence that can really make a difference in convincing policymakers in the criminal justice system to become aware and appreciate the value of yoga in the prison population. And then finally, this paper here, very recently published, and this is out of Israeli prisons. And this is an enormous study. The sample size was huge here. It was in the thousands. And what they were looking at here was the actual recidivism rate, the reincarceration rate following release. So this is release at 0.0 here, and this is 5 years out. And what you can see is that the yoga group is much reduced in terms, though, of the level of recidivism. 40% of the criminals released after 5 years were back in jail, whereas only 33%. So this is really a very strong statistic, a very well done study, and really addressing the most important one of the most important characteristics in the prison population, and that is reducing recidivism. Now, I want to finish by giving you a sense of what this is like on the ground. How does this play out in the prisoner, him or herself? So these are actually quotes from a number of studies that have been done that have looked at interviews and actually comments from the participants who practice the yoga. So this individual said, "It was something I looked forward to each week, towards feeling relaxed and calm. I would just feel really relaxed and at peace." And another one said, "There's less thoughts going through my head." So both of these are, directly tapping into that logic model that I showed you. We're talking about these positive psychological states, this sense of reduction in stress. This is this whole idea of self-regulation of thought processes. Another said you would have a negative day and then come there, and after you had done it, it was nice, it was calming. Like sometimes you didn't feel like starting, but once you started, and the effects lasted, they were ongoing. Another said, "It just made me feel good about myself. I felt equal." So there's a sense of self-empowerment, self-efficacy. Another said, "It just made everything go away, I guess. I just forgot about everything. It just clears your mind, puts you in a good mood for the rest of the day and maybe even the next day." So there's the self-regulation of thought processes, the metacognition, and the change in mood state that's accompanied with that. Another said, "On the night after the yoga session, it was a lot easier to go asleep." And sleep is all about psychophysiological arousal, both mental and physical. And as you reduce the stress activation in the mind and the body, you actually sleep deeper. Another said it had a positive impact. This is written by the authors, that it had a positive impact the session had on his sleep, not just the night after yoga, but as other times as well. So as as yoga practice continues, these benefits start to accrue over a longer time frame. There are changes that take place in the central nervous system, not just in brain activity and brain biochemistry, but even in brain structure. And the longer you practice, the more these changes are ensconced into a change in behavior overall. This is from another study, learning how to control parts of your body and mind connection and breathing, basically, and become more aware of your body. There's the mind-body awareness. I like the meditation because I became more in tune with different parts of my body. Again, this interoception or this mindfulness, mind-body awareness. For me, I like the whole. I like yoga, period, now. I'm a believer. I love yoga now. So here's this transformation, this idea of once you get into the practice, it becomes sustainable and self-sustaining. Another said, yoga is really a stress reliever. I'm still shocked. Every time I say it, I catch myself saying it like, yoga? I would never have thought I would be doing yoga. It's calming. It soothes me. When I'm stretching, I'm in meditation. I'm at peace with myself. I'm more aware of my mind and my body. So here's both the self-regulation of emotion and stress and the mind-body awareness. And this idea here, I'm still shocked. You know, yoga has this image in society that it's something that's practiced just by thin, rich, middle-aged white women in leotards. And that is a problem. And we need to be able to convey to all kinds of populations that yoga can be used by everyone, and specifically, it has benefit in the prison population. Another said, I've actually changed a lot since I've been coming to yoga. Before I would be a very stressful person, and now I'm more open. I can't explain, like it loosened me. Another said, it helps me when I'm angry, because when I'm angry, I make stupid decisions that get me in places like this. It helps me stay calm when I get overly angry. So here's anger management, and here's emotion regulation. Think about stuff before you react, more of responding before you act. This is actually the definition of metacognition, not responding automatically to your negative emotions and thought processes. And then finally, looking at my thoughts instead of interacting with it directly. It helps me to learn more about myself. The yoga classes help me be more philosophical about life. I take a different approach to things. You're more in the observer position in those yoga classes. You're observing more than interacting. This is all about, again, self-regulation of thought processes and behavior. And in this study here, one of the biggest things that I learned on my mat is that I don't have to react to discomfort. Whether that discomfort is physical, emotional, a craving to get high, or a desire to physically attack someone, I'm able to sit in that feeling for a few more breaths and take a more objective look at what's going on in my mind and my emotions without having to act on it. Another said, one of the most important things I learned was how to take a moment to breathe, reflect, and remain calm when I have strong feelings, while knowing that it's okay to feel whatever I feel. I don't have to justify or explain my feelings to anyone. They're my feelings, and it's okay. I can work through them, and that's what's really important. Very important description of emotion regulation. I've learned that I can actually remain calm. Not to say that I never fly off the handle anymore, but I'm a lot calmer than I have been in the past. So this is resilience and stress regulation. And then finally, that's going to be safer for everyone, other inmates and staff both. Guys are not likely to be as reactive or as violent. And that mindset and attitude can travel throughout the rest of the population as well, even to the people who aren't going to yoga classes. So this is this really critical point, is that the larger the number of participants practice yoga in any kind of social environment, the more that's going to change the behavior and the actual sense of emotion and stress regulation amongst the entire institution itself. So I am the research director for the Yoga Alliance, and my role through the Yoga Alliance is really education of the science and research on yoga, which is what I'm doing in this presentation. And if you go onto the Yoga Alliance website and click on yoga, that will take you to the scientific research on yoga page. There's yoga research videos, yoga research webinars, including a webinar on yoga for the prison populations, including also many citations in different categories. And you can go to those categories and find research on a variety of different topics. And we have the citations for yoga in the prison population under institutional workplace populations research. I'm also supported, and I'm the research director for the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports the style of yoga that I practice. I also work closely with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I am the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Yoga Therapy and coordinate the symposium on yoga research. And I close with this criminal justice-related cartoon. Frankly, counselor, I don't care how stressful this is for your client. Tell them to get out of that damn yoga position. So thanks for your attention. And I'm now happy to see what we have in terms of questions. And the first one here I see is, how are inmates supported when triggers of stress activation may occur? Are they able to and or encouraged to recognize the emotions that may come up? Is the explanation of the autonomic nervous system part of the therapy? You know, the whole idea of explaining this and how it works, it can be useful, but it's really not necessary, because when you do the practices, you experience those improvements in motion regulation, especially in the quotes that I gave in the last few slides, this whole idea of the triggers of stress activation. It's the idea of less reactivity to your own thought processes. And that is this self-regulation of thought processes that takes place. You become less reactive. There's the gap between the trigger and your response. And we've seen this in all kinds of populations. We've done studies on yoga in public schools, and we get anecdotes of the kids coming back and saying, my brother took my toy away the other day and I was going to hit him, but then I took a deep breath and just relaxed and decided not to. And that kind of sort of gap, that change in your relationship to your thought processes, the release from automatic behavior, is what we're talking about. That's this whole self-regulation of emotion and stress. Here's a question: have corrections departments in different countries begun to acknowledge these benefits and support the introduction of these programs in prisons? Or is it still fairly sporadic, where Prison Yoga Project or others have already established partnerships? It is very small. It's true. However, it is growing. And the most important thing that's going to convince the prisons is the research. That is the language of modern society. It's science. And you can't walk into a prison population into a policymaker or a prison warden, for example, and start talking about chakras and prana and that kind of thing. That's yoga language. They don't understand yoga language. They understand scientific language. So you come in with some papers, you start talking about emotion regulation, you talk about stress regulation, you show the results, you talk about the randomized control trials, you show them a few review papers. That's the language that the policymakers in prisons are going to understand. So that's the kind of thing that's going to facilitate this movement of yoga into the prisons most powerfully. And that's not just true of prison populations, it's true of all of society and all of society's institutions. It's the same for yoga in the public schools, and it's the same for yoga in medicine. We need the research to show that it's safe and that it's effective. And that is what's going to make the difference in terms of implementation. So here's a question: how has this work informed your own practice? What yogic themes do you feel you have worked through the most? Well, that's kind of a personal question, but I think for all of you who have practiced yoga, it's no surprise. I mean, we've all had this sense of reduction in stress, and that logic model is what we experience. We experience these changes in our physical body. We see the improvements in self-regulation of stress and emotion. We become more sensitive, more aware. We improve in our mindfulness, our interception, and our mind-body awareness. And then finally, many of us have had this deeper transformation. Yoga changed my life. When people say that, that is a highly significant statement. They're not saying, oh, yoga changed my shoulder, my arthritis is a little better. No, yoga changed my life. That statement, which I'm sure some of you have heard, and I've heard many times, is rather profound, and it really conveys something about what's happening at this deeper level. People are changing their perspective on life, their relationship to themselves, to their goals in life, to the rest of society. And that, for a prisoner, can be an enormous change in terms of changing behavior, which is really critical for prison populations. Another question here is, given the frequency of brain injuries that are found in persons in the prison system, how can yoga help with those who have brain injuries? Is there research on this? Yoga with those who have brain injuries specifically. There is some research that's been done on traumatic brain injury, or TBI, but just a few papers. But it does show that things like emotion regulation, which is one of the big things that is a negative with respect to traumatic brain injury, really is. And traumatic brain injury is often very much associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. The two often go together. And we have a growing body of evidence. In fact, there's even, we have a webinar on the Yoga Alliance website where I've talked about the research on yoga for post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, my own laboratory has conducted several trials of yoga for post-traumatic stress disorder showing positive benefit. So indeed, I think that yoga can contribute to positive benefits with things like traumatic brain injury. Another question, can you direct me to research on yoga in the public schools? So yeah, if you go on to PubMed, which is the government's website that lists all of the citations on research, and type in the word yoga and then public schools and then the word review, and you'll get a number of hits of review papers that have been published summarizing the research that's been done on yoga in public schools. And like the research on yoga in prisons, it's small. We're talking about fewer than 50 papers that have been published. And in science, 50 papers is really next to nothing. But nevertheless, it's growing very rapidly. And all this research has really happened virtually in the past couple of decades. So this is actually a very exciting time for yoga research in general, whether it's yoga in schools, whether it's yoga in healthcare, whether it's yoga for burnout in healthcare professionals, or yoga in the prison population. The research is really critical, and it's a really exciting time for the field of research on yoga. So that brings us to the end of our time frame here. Thank you for joining me today for this webinar, Yoga in Prisons, the Scientific Rationale and Research Evidence on the Give Back Yoga University. You can learn more about my work and find a schedule of my upcoming webinars at yogaalliance.org, and find more GBYU talks, classes, and workshops at gby.university/schedule. That's gby.university/schedule. Remember, all the funds raised through GBYU support not-for-profit yoga projects in prisons, hospitals, and community care centers. So your financial support is going towards a great cause. Thanks again for participating, and do have a great day. And please avail yourselves of all of the research that's out there. And it's not hard to find. Thanks very much. Take care.